My son texted, "Dad, do not come. My in-laws do not want you here." I was standing in front of my full-length mirror, already dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than my son's first car, adjusting a silk tie with hands that were still rough from 50 years of handling concrete and steel. On the bed behind me sat a velvet box containing a cashier's check for $500,000, a gift for the party I had secretly paid $150,000 to organize. I did not cry. I did not call him back to beg for an invitation to my own son's rehearsal dinner. I just looked at my reflection, a 70-year-old man who built half the skyline of this city, and I made one single phone call that lasted 30 seconds. That call left everyone absolutely stunned and taught my son that you never bite the hand that feeds you. Before I tell you exactly what I said on that call and how the night ended in handcuffs and tears, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to this old builder to know my story is being heard. I sat down at my desk, the heavy solid mahogany cool under my forearms. This desk was the first expensive thing I ever bought for myself 30 years ago, a silent trophy from when Sullivan & Co. landed the contract to build the municipal stadium. The room was quiet, smelling of old paper and lemon polish. I uncapped my fountain pen, the weight of the gold barrel familiar and comforting in my grip. I looked down at the check in front of me. $500,000. The ink was still wet on the date line. October 14th. It was a lot of money. To most people, it was a life-changing amount. To me, Thomas Sullivan, it was the dividends from a single quarter of a good year. But my son Brian did not know that. Brian thought this money represented my life savings. He thought his old man was scraping the bottom of his retirement fund to help him and his new bride start their life. I blew on the ink gently. This check was supposed to be the surprise highlight of tonight's rehearsal dinner at the Gilded Oak, the most exclusive country club in the state. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked at the framed photo on the corner of the desk. It was Brian, at 7 years old, holding a plastic hammer, wearing a hard hat that was 3 sizes too big. He looked so happy then, so eager to build things just like his dad. I sighed, the sound heavy in the empty room. Somewhere along the way, that eagerness had turned into a desperate need to please others, specifically to please Tiffany Harrington and her parents, Richard and Cynthia. Brian had come to me 2 weeks ago, sweating through his shirt, asking for a loan. He called it an investment opportunity. He used buzzwords he had learned in business school, talking about leverage and equity. But I saw right through him. I saw the panic in his eyes. I knew he was trying to cover the lavish down payment on a house in the hills that the Harringtons insisted was the only suitable place for their daughter to live. I had told him I would think about it. This check was my answer. I was going to give it to him tonight, not as a loan, but as a gift, a fresh start. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. I remembered the day I officially stepped down as the public face of the company 5 years ago. I handed Brian the title of Director of Operations. I let him move into the corner office with the glass walls. I let him think he was running the show. It was my way of letting him feel like a man, like a leader. But what Brian never bothered to check, and what he certainly never told his fiancée, was that I retained 51% of the voting stock. I was retired on paper, but in reality I was still the chairman of the board. I still approved every major acquisition. I still owned the buildings, the equipment, and the land. To Brian, and especially to the Harringtons, I was just a retired contractor, living on a pension, driving a 10-year-old Ford pickup truck because I refused to buy a new one. They mistook my frugality for poverty. They mistook my silence for ignorance. I walked back to the desk to put the check into the silver gift box. That was when my phone buzzed against the hard wood. The screen lit up with a notification, a text message from Brian. I smiled instinctively. He was probably asking if I was on my way, or maybe asking me to bring that old bottle of scotch we used to share on special occasions. I picked up the phone, my reading glasses sliding down my nose. The smile died on my lips instantly. Dad, do not come. My in-laws do not want you here. I stared at the words. I read them again, thinking I must have misunderstood. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe it was a joke. But the follow-up message came 3 seconds later, delivering the second blow. They have invited Senator Miller and some VIP investors. They think your style is a bit too blue-collar for the atmosphere they are trying to set. They are worried you might embarrass them. Please understand, Dad. I will send you pictures later. Love you. My hand did not shake. I did not throw the phone. A strange, cold calm washed over me, the same calm I used to feel when a project was going off the rails and I had to step in to fix it. Blue collar. Embarrass them. I looked down at my hands. Yes, they were calloused. There was a scar on my left thumb from a table saw accident in 1982. My knuckles were swollen from years of gripping trowels and hammers. These hands had poured the foundation of the very club where they were dining tonight. These hands had signed the checks that paid for the wine they were currently drinking. The Harringtons. Richard Harrington was a stockbroker who hadn't made a successful trade since the mid-90s. He was living on credit and past glories, driving a leased Bentley and wearing suits he couldn't afford to dry clean. And Cynthia, a woman who treated waiters like furniture. They thought I was the embarrassment. And my son. My own flesh and blood. He had agreed to this. He had typed those words. He had chosen their hollow prestige over his own father's dignity. He was willing to banish me from a party I paid for just to keep his father-in-law happy. I sat the phone down gently. I could feel the anger simmering deep in my gut, but it wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a young man. It was the cold, hard resolve of an old wolf who has been bitten by a puppy. I picked up the check, $500,000. I looked at Brian's name written in my careful block handwriting. I thought about the house he wanted to buy. I thought about the way he looked at Tiffany like a dog waiting for a scrap of food. I did not rip the check, not yet. That would be too easy. That would be emotional. And tonight was not about emotion. Tonight was about business. I dialed Brian's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it went to voicemail. He was screening me. He was probably sitting at the head table laughing at something Richard said, checking his phone under the napkin and hitting ignore. He thought I would just stay home. He thought I would sit here in my recliner, watch the news, and wait for him to send me a few photos of the cake cutting. He thought I was a pushover. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. It was a custom fit, tailored by the same man who dressed the governor, but I doubt the Harringtons would recognize quality if it wasn't plastered with a designer logo. I grabbed the silver gift box with the check inside. I grabbed my car keys, not the keys to the Ford truck. I reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out the key fob to the vintage Mercedes convertible. I kept under a tarp in the garage, the one I hadn't driven in 2 years. If they were worried about appearances, I would give them an appearance they would never forget. I walked out of my study, turning off the lights. The house was quiet, but my mind was loud with calculations. I wasn't going there to cause a scene. I wasn't going there to yell or scream. I was going there to clarify a few misunderstandings regarding ownership, net worth, and exactly who was paying for the filet mignon they were about to eat. They didn't want the construction worker. Fine. Tonight they were going to meet the chairman. I walked into the garage, pulled the cover off the car, and started the engine. The roar of the motor echoed against the concrete walls. I backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. I turned onto the main road, heading toward the hills, toward the Gilded Oak. As I drove, I thought about the text message one last time. Dad, don't come. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Oh, I was coming, Brian. And I was bringing a reality check that was going to bounce harder than Richard Harrington's credit rating. I pulled up to the security gate of the country club. The guard, a young man named Steve, who I had hired personally 3 years ago, stepped out of the booth. He looked at the car, then looked at me. His eyes widened. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, standing up straighter. "I didn't see your name on the guest list for the Harrington party. They gave me strict instructions." I rolled down the window and looked him in the eye. "Steve, who signs your paycheck, you do, Mr. Sullivan," he replied instantly. "Open the gate, Steve, and call Garcia. Tell him I am coming in through the back. I want access to the security room." Steve didn't hesitate. He hit the button. The iron gates swung open. I drove through up the winding driveway lined with the oak trees I had planted myself 20 years ago. The clubhouse loomed ahead, lit up like a palace. I could see the guests mingling on the terrace. I could hear the jazz band playing. It looked perfect. It looked expensive. I parked the car in the owner's spot right next to Richard's leased Bentley. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment in the silence. I looked at the gift box on the passenger seat. This was it. The moment of truth. I wasn't just a father tonight. I was a reckoning. I opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. I adjusted my cuffs, picked up the box, and walked toward the service entrance. They wanted me to be invisible. They wanted me to be absent. They were about to get their wish, but first they were going to learn exactly what it cost to disrespect Thomas Sullivan. I pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped into the kitchen, where the staff paused and looked at me with recognition and fear. "Where is Garcia?" I asked quietly. The head chef pointed toward the office. I walked past the sizzling pans and the trays of hors d'oeuvres that I had paid for. I walked straight to the heart of the operation. It was time to pull the plug. I pulled my 2014 Ford F-150 pickup truck up to the main gate of the Gilded Oak. The engine rumbled with a sound that was more agricultural than refined, a stark contrast to the purr of the limousines and luxury sedans gliding ahead of me. I loved this truck. It had dust on the dashboard and blueprints in the back seat. It smelled like sawdust and hard work. But tonight, apparently, it smelled like embarrassment. A private security guard I did not recognize stepped out of the booth. He was not one of my regular employees. He was wearing a uniform that looked too new with gold epaulets that looked ridiculous. Richard Harrington must have hired an outside firm to ensure the riffraff stayed out. The guard took one look at my truck, then at me through the windshield, and held up a gloved hand with a sneer that said everything I needed to know about my status in his eyes. I rolled down the window. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and the exhaust of a Porsche waiting behind me. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, though his tone suggested he wanted me to turn around and leave. "Deliveries are around the back. The kitchen entrance is the third left turn." "I am not a delivery driver," I said, keeping my voice even. "My name is Thomas Sullivan. I am here for the rehearsal dinner." The guard picked up a clipboard and made a show of running his finger down a laminated list. He took his time, letting the driver of the Porsche behind me honk his horn impatiently. "Sullivan, Sullivan," he muttered. "I am sorry, sir. I do not see a Thomas Sullivan on the VIP guest list for the Harrington party. Perhaps you have the wrong venue." I gripped the steering wheel. My knuckles turned white. It was not a mistake. It was a blockade. Richard had actually done it. He had erased me from the door list of a building I constructed with my own sweat. I picked up my phone from the center console. I dialed Brian again. This time he answered on the first ring, but his voice was a hushed whisper, as if he was hiding in a bathroom stall. "Dad." "I told you," Brian hissed. "Please tell me you are not at the front gate. I am looking at a rent, a cop who tells me my name is not on the list, Brian. I paid $150,000 for this dinner. I signed the check for the deposit on this venue. And now I am being turned away like a beggar. Explain this to me, son. Look me in the eye even over the phone and tell me why." There was a silence on the line, heavy and suffocating. Then Brian spoke, and his voice trembled with a mixture of fear and shame that made my stomach turn. "It is not me, Dad. It is Tiffany and her parents. They invited Senator Miller. They have the CEO of Nexus Corp inside. They said your image does not fit." "My image," I repeated, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. "Yes," Brian continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "They said you look too blue-collar. Richard said your hands are calloused and rough, and that you look like a laborer. He said having a retired construction worker at the head table would confuse the investors. They want to project an image of old money, Dad. They think you will ruin the aesthetic." I listened to my son's voice, feeling a cold numbness spread through my chest. It wasn't just Richard. Brian was relaying these insults without defending me. He was accepting their premise that honest work was something to be hidden. So I asked quietly, "You agreed with them? You agreed that your father, the man who paid for your college, the man who bought your first car, is too dirty to sit with your new family?" "Dad." "It is just for one night," Brian pleaded. "Just go home. We will do a private dinner next week. Just you and me. Somewhere casual. Somewhere you are comfortable. Please, Dad, do not make a scene. The cars are piling up behind you." I looked up at the clubhouse looming against the night sky. The gilded oak. It looked magnificent. The limestone pillars were lit by soft amber floodlights. The slate roof gleamed. It was a fortress of wealth and exclusion. But I saw something else. I saw the swamp that used to be here 20 years ago. I remembered the smell of the stagnant water and the mosquitoes. Everyone told me I was crazy to buy this land. They said it was a sinkhole. They said nothing could be built here. I remembered standing in mud up to my knees, holding the topographical maps, arguing with the city engineers about drainage. I remembered the 18-hour days running the excavators myself because we were behind schedule and over budget. I remembered the day we poured the foundation, thousands of tons of concrete that had to be perfect. I knew every steel beam in that structure. I knew where the electrical conduits ran inside the walls. I knew that the third pillar on the left of the portico had a 1999 penny buried in the mortar for good luck. I built this place. I didn't just buy it. I created it. And now my son was telling me I wasn't good enough to walk through the doors I had hung with my own hands. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. They were worried about my calloused hands. They didn't realize those hands held the deed to the ground they were standing on. "Okay, Brian," I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "I understand. You have made your choice. You want to play the part of the aristocrat. You do not want the builder around." "Thank you, Dad." Brian exhaled, sounding relieved. "Thank you for understanding. I knew you would not want to be uncomfortable anyway. I will call you tomorrow." He hung up. The line went dead. The guard tapped on my window with his flashlight. "Sir, you are blocking the entrance. You need to turn around. There is a service road to the left that will take you back to the highway." I looked at the guard. I looked at the line of luxury cars behind me. I looked at the clubhouse one last time. I shifted the truck into reverse, then into drive. I turned the wheel. But I did not head for the highway. I drove slowly around the perimeter of the parking lot, away from the valet stand, toward the darkness of the service side of the building. "Where are you going?" the guard shouted, stepping out of his booth. "You cannot go back there. That is for staff only." I ignored him. I knew exactly where I was going. I knew that around the back corner, hidden behind a row of neatly trimmed hedges, was the delivery dock and the staff entrance. And I knew that entrance had a biometric lock that I had installed myself. I pulled the truck into the shadows near the dumpsters. I killed the engine. I sat there in the dark for a moment, listening to the distant sound of the jazz band playing inside. They were celebrating. They were toasting to their future, a future financed by my money, built on my labor, while I sat by the garbage. I pulled out my phone again. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. Garcia. Garcia had started as a busboy when the club first opened. I had seen his work ethic. I had promoted him. I had paid for his mother's surgery when she got sick 5 years ago. He was the general manager now, the man who ran the show, but he never forgot who signed the checks. I pressed the call button. Mr. Sullivan Garcia answered on the second ring, his voice professional but warm. I did not expect to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right with the transfer for the payment? The payment is fine, Garcia, I said. I am currently sitting in my truck at the loading dock. The loading dock, Garcia repeated, confusion in his voice. Sir, why are you not at the front door? We have the presidential table set up for you. My son and his father-in-law seem to think I am not classy enough for the front door, Garcia. They have security turning me away. They think I am a liability. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Then Garcia's voice dropped an octave, turning cold and serious. Mr. Harrington ordered this. Yes, I said, and my son went along with it. Mr. Sullivan Garcia said, I will come out there right now personally. I will escort you through the front door, and I will throw anyone who disrespects you out on the street. Just say the word. No, Garcia, I said. Not yet. I do not want to make a scene at the door. I want to see exactly what I paid for. I want to see what they are saying when they think I am not around. I want you to open the service entrance for me, and then I want you to take me to the security surveillance room. The surveillance room, Garcia asked. Yes. I want to watch the party on the monitors. I want to hear the audio feeds. I want to know exactly who I am dealing with before I walk into that room. Can you do that for me? Consider it done, Mr. Sullivan, Garcia said. I am walking to the back door now. I hung up the phone and stepped out of the truck. The night air was cold. I straightened my jacket. I smoothed my tie. They wanted to hide me in the dark. They wanted to treat me like the help. Fine. I would enter like the help. But I would leave as the owner. And before this night was over, everyone in that ballroom would know exactly who built the floor they were dancing on. I walked toward the steel door, waiting for the click of the lock, ready to begin the demolition. Garcia opened the steel door before I even had a chance to knock. He stood there, in his immaculate black suit, the lights of the kitchen reflecting off his polished shoes. He didn't look at me with pity or confusion. He looked at me with the absolute deference of a soldier greeting his general. Good evening, Mr. Sullivan, Garcia said, stepping aside to let me in. He gestured to the kitchen staff, a silent command that made them avert their eyes and focus intently on their chopping and sautéing. They knew the drill. The owner was on site, and he was in stealth mode. I walked past the stainless steel counters, smelling the rosemary and garlic of the prime rib I had approved for the menu 3 weeks ago. It was strange to be back of house, moving through the steam and the noise while my credit card was being charged for the party out front. Garcia led me through the labyrinth of corridors past the wine cellar to a nondescript door marked with a simple sign that read, Authorized personnel only. He punched in a code, scanned his thumb, and held the door open. I stepped into the security control room. It was cool, dark, and hummed with the quiet power of high-end electronics. This room was the brain of the Gilded Oak. When I built this place, I insisted on a surveillance system that rivaled a casino. I wanted to see every corner of my investment. Sit here, sir, Garcia said, pulling out the main ergonomic chair in front of the wall of monitors. I sat down. The leather sighed under my weight. In front of me, a dozen high-definition screens flickered with live feeds from every angle of the club. The parking lot, the lobby, the hallways, and the grand ballroom. Bring up the main table, I said, leaning forward. And give me the audio feed. Garcia's fingers flew across the keyboard. The central monitor, a massive 60-inch 4K screen, flared to life. The image was crystal clear. It was like I was floating right above the centerpiece of white lilies and orchids. There they were, the Harrington clan. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with the expensive Cabernet I had selected. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked a size too small, straining at the buttons. Beside him was Cynthia, dripping in jewelry that I suspected was paste or rented. And there was my son Brian, looking small and terrified, clutching a glass of water like a life raft. Next to him was Tiffany, glowing with a triumph that made my skin crawl. I watched as Richard stood up, tapping a spoon against his crystal glass. The room went silent. I motioned for Garcia to boost the volume. Richard's voice filled the small security room, crisp and clear, as if he were standing right next to me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, puffing out his chest, "I want to welcome you all to the Gilded Oak. As many of you know, the Harrington family has been coming here since the doors opened. It is practically our second home. When Tiffany told me she wanted to get married, I told her, sweetheart, spare no expense. Your father will handle it. We rented this entire facility tonight because my little girl deserves nothing but the best." I felt a vein throb in my temple. Spare no expense. My expense. He was claiming credit for every dollar I had spent. He was standing on my floor under my chandelier, eating my food, and telling a room full of senators and CEOs that he was the benefactor. Garcia cleared his throat softly. He walked over to a filing cabinet in the corner, unlocked it, and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it gently on the desk in front of me. "I think you should see this, Mr. Sullivan," Garcia said quietly, "since you are auditing the operations tonight." I opened the folder. It was a financial profile on Richard Harrington. As the owner of the club, I had the right to review the standing of any member. What I saw made me let out a low, humorless whistle. Richard Harrington wasn't just broke. He was underwater. He was drowning. The document on top was a delinquency notice. Richard hadn't paid his membership dues in 3 years, 36 months. The only reason his membership hadn't been revoked was because Brian had quietly paid the last 2 installments from his own account. I flipped the page. A credit check run by the club's finance department when Richard tried to book the ballroom 3 months ago. Declined. Insufficient funds. 7 active liens against his primary residence. A credit score that was lower than the temperature outside. This wasn't a noble lineage. This was a house of cards held together by hairspray and delusion. They weren't aristocrats. They were grifters in Gucci belts. I looked up at the screen. Richard was sitting down now, basking in the applause of the guests who thought he was a titan of industry. He leaned over to whisper something to the senator next to him, probably a lie about his investment portfolio. "Can you isolate the audio on the bride and her mother?" I asked Garcia. Garcia nodded and adjusted the parabolic microphone settings on the touchscreen. The ambient noise of the party faded away, replaced by the hushed, sharp whispers of the 2 women sitting to Brian's left. Tiffany was leaning in close to her mother, Cynthia. They were clinking their wine glasses. "Did you see the text?" Tiffany asked, a smirk playing on her lips. "Brian said the old man isn't coming. He actually bought the excuse about the VIPs. "Thank God," Cynthia sighed, taking a long sip of wine. "I was terrified he would show up in some flannel shirt and work boots. It is hard enough convincing the senator to invest in Richard's new venture without having a bricklayer sitting across from him." "He is not just a bricklayer," Mom Tiffany giggled. "He is our golden goose. Brian says he is bringing a check tonight. 500,000. I stared at the screen. My hand instinctively went to the breast pocket of my jacket, where the torn pieces of that check should have been, but instead I felt the sharp corner of the folded invoice I had printed out earlier. 500,000. Cynthia whispered, her eyes widening with greed. That is enough to cover the interest on the bridge loan and keep the bank from foreclosing on the house for another 6 months. We just need to get that check into the account by Monday morning. It gets better, Tiffany said, lowering her voice even further. I leaned in closer to the speaker, my breath hitching in my throat. Brian signed the prenup exactly the way Daddy wrote it up, Tiffany said. He didn't even have a lawyer look at it. He thinks it is just standard procedure. Once we get the money and the wedding is official, his assets merge with ours. We can use his credit line to refinance the debt. And what about the old man? Cynthia asked. He is going to be a problem eventually. He controls the son too much. Don't worry about him, Tiffany said, her voice turning icy and cruel. Once we secure the funds and the marriage license is signed, I am going to have Brian work on him. We will say he is getting senile. You know, forgetting things, acting erratic. Brian is so soft he will believe it if I say it enough times. We can probably get power of attorney within a year. Then we put him in that facility upstate. The one with the high walls. He won't be bothering us at the country club then. The room seemed to tilt. The air in the security booth felt suddenly thin. Toes him into a facility. Declare me incompetent. Take my life's work, my dignity, and lock me away so they could spend my money on their charade. And Brian, my son. They viewed him as nothing more than a tool, a soft touch, a means to an end. They were going to bleed him dry and then use him to bury me. I looked at Brian on the screen. He was staring at Tiffany with adoration, completely oblivious that the woman he was about to marry was plotting to dismantle his father's life. He was a sheep sitting at a table of wolves, and he had just invited them to dinner. I sat back in the chair. The shock faded, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This wasn't just a snub. This was war. They weren't just trying to exclude me. They were trying to erase me. I closed the folder on the desk. I looked at Garcia. His face was pale. He had heard every word. He looked at me, waiting for an order, waiting for an explosion. But I didn't explode. Builders don't explode. We deconstruct. We take things apart brick by brick, beam by beam, until the structure fails. Garcia. I said, my voice steady and low. Do you have the master override for the ballroom audiovisual system? Yes, sir, Garcia said. I can control everything from here. The screens, the microphones, the lights. Good, I said. And do we still have that policy regarding members who are more than 90 days delinquent on their dues? Yes, sir, Garcia replied, a small grim smile touching his lips. Immediate suspension of privileges and a ban from the premises until the debt is settled in full. Excellent, I said. Print out Mr. Harrington's full ledger. Every unpaid martini, every bounced check, every month of unpaid dues. And Garcia, yes, Mr. Sullivan. Cut the music. It is time for a toast. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I checked my reflection in the dark monitor one last time. The old man in the flannel shirt wasn't coming to dinner. The owner was coming, and he was bringing the eviction notice. I turned and walked out of the security room, heading toward the service corridor that led directly to the stage entrance of the ballroom. The wolves were eating, and I was about to flip the table. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob of the security room. I was ready to walk out there and end this charade, but Garcia called out to me. His voice was urgent, shaking me from my momentum. Mr. Sullivan, he said, you need to see this. Wait. I turned back. Garcia was pointing at the main monitor. On the screen, the camera had zoomed in automatically on my son Brian. He wasn't looking down at the table anymore. He wasn't looking terrified. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine, a look of arrogant confidence on his face that I did not recognize. It was a look that didn't belong to the boy I raised. It belonged to a stranger. I walked back to the console and leaned in, my eyes fixed on the screen. Richard Harrington was laughing, patting Brian on the back. You know, Brian, Richard said, his voice oozing with that fake camaraderie I despised. Once we get this check, we are in the clear for a few months. But we need a long-term solution. Your father's assets are substantial. But if he is as stubborn as you say, accessing the real capital might be difficult while he is still lucid. I watched Brian. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to say that I was sharp as a tack, that I still ran circles around men half my age, that I was the one who taught him everything he knew. I waited for my son to be a man. Instead, Brian chuckled. It was a dry, dismissive sound. "Do not worry about the old man," Richard, Brian said. He waved his hand dismissively in the air. "Dad is losing it. He is practically senile these days. Half the time I do not think he knows what day of the week it is. He just sits in that house watching old westerns." My breath caught in my throat. Senile. Losing it. I ran a multi-million-dollar corporation from my home office. I tracked market trends daily. I knew the price of steel in Shanghai before Brian had even had his morning coffee. But to him, my silence was senility. My trust was weakness. Brian leaned in closer to the center of the table, lowering his voice, but the high-tech microphones picked up every syllable with devastating clarity. "He trusts me implicitly." Brian continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "He signs whatever I put in front of him. He does not even read the documents anymore. He just looks at me with those tired eyes and signs on the dotted line." Tiffany giggled, stroking Brian's arm. "That is so smart, baby." "It is better than smart," Brian said. "It is done. I already have the papers prepared for the house transfer. The deed to the estate. I slipped it into a stack of insurance renewals last week. He thinks he was signing off on flood coverage. Once I file those papers on Monday morning, the house is in my name. We can leverage the equity immediately. That is another $3 million easy." I felt like I had been punched in the solar plexus. The room swam for a second. I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from falling. He wasn't just letting them insult me. He wasn't just borrowing money to impress them. He was stealing my home. He was stealing the house where he grew up, the house where his mother died, the house I built with my own hands for our family. He had looked me in the face, handed me a stack of papers, and lied to me, banking on the idea that I was too old and stupid to catch him. I remembered that day last week. He had come over for coffee. He had seemed helpful, organized. "Dad, just some paperwork for the property insurance," he had said. I had signed it because I trusted him, because fathers are supposed to trust their sons. I had nursed a viper in my bosom. I had raised a boy, given him every opportunity, handed him a career, and in return, he was plotting to leave me homeless to fund his father-in-law's gambling debts. The sadness I had felt earlier evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, white-hot clarity. The father in me died in that moment, right there in the security room. The man who remained was the CEO, the builder who knew that when a foundation is rotten, you don't patch it, you tear it down. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now, deadly steady. I scrolled past Brian's name. I scrolled past the family contacts. I stopped on a name that struck fear into the hearts of contractors and city inspectors alike. Ben Stone, my personal attorney. The man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had dug the holes. I pressed call. It was 8 o'clock on a Friday night, but Ben answered on the second ring. He knew that if I was calling at this hour, the building was either on fire or I was buying a new one. "Tom," Ben said, his voice rasping slightly. "Everything okay?" "No, Ben," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, devoid of warmth, stripped of mercy. "Nothing is okay, but it is about to be corrected." "What do you need, Tom?" "I need you to open your laptop, Ben. Right now." I could hear the rustle of movement on the other end, the sound of a chair scraping, the click of keys. "I am opening it." "What am I looking for?" "I want you to access the internal ledgers for the Sullivan Logistics branch. Brian's branch." There was a pause. Silence stretched over the line. "Tom, that is highly irregular. Brian is the director. Is there a problem with the quarterly report?" I am not interested in the report, Ben, I said, staring at the screen where my son was now toasting with his father-in-law celebrating their theft. I want you to look at the escrow accounts. I want you to look at the capital reserve. And I want you to cross-reference every withdrawal over $50,000 in the last 6 months with the shell companies associated with Richard Harrington. Tom Ben said slowly, his voice dropping. You are asking me to audit your son for embezzlement. I am asking you to find the money he stole, Ben, I snapped. He just admitted on tape to fraud. He admitted to tricking me into signing a deed transfer for my personal residence. If he is willing to steal my house, he has already picked the company clean. I know it. I can feel it. I heard the rapid clatter of typing. Ben was moving fast now. He sensed the blood in the water. Give me 2 minutes, Ben said. I am logging into the master admin account. I waited. On the screen, the party continued. The waiters were clearing the appetizer plates. Brian was laughing, his head thrown back, looking like the king of the world. He had no idea that the guillotine blade was already falling. Tom Ben's voice came back tight and sharp. I am looking at the operating account for the logistics hub. There is a discrepancy. How much, I asked. There was a wire transfer 3 days ago. $2 million. It was flagged as an equipment acquisition for a new distribution center in Nevada. We don't have a distribution center in Nevada, I said coldly. Exactly, Ben said. The funds were wired to a holding company called RH Ventures LLC. Richard Harrington, I said. It wasn't a question. It looks that way, Ben confirmed. Tom, this is a felony. This is grand larceny, corporate espionage. If we report this, if I interrupted him, there is no if, Ben. I want you to freeze it. I can try to put a stop payment on it, but if it has cleared, freeze everything else I ordered. Lock him out of the system. Revoke his security clearance. Cancel his company credit cards. I want his key card to stop working before dessert is served. And Ben, yes, Tom. Draft the termination papers. For cause, gross misconduct, theft, and prepare a civil suit against Richard Harrington for the recovery of stolen corporate assets. Tom Ben said gently. He is your son. This will send him to prison. I looked at the screen one last time. I looked at the boy who had just bragged about tricking his senile father. I don't have a son, Ben. I have an employee who just stole $2 million. Do it, and call the police. Tell them to meet me at the Gilded Oak. I hung up the phone. I didn't look at Garcia. I didn't need to. I knew he was standing at attention, ready for the next command. I turned away from the monitors. I was done watching. It was time to introduce myself to the guests. I remained in the security control room for a few moments longer, my eyes fixed on the 60-inch monitor that displayed the banquet in high definition. The previous rage had cooled into something solid and heavy like a block of ice sitting in my stomach. I needed to see this. I needed to witness the full extent of their hubris before I brought the hammer down. On the screen, the waiters were pouring champagne. Not just any champagne, but a vintage Dom Perignon that retailed for $300 a bottle. I watched as Richard Harrington stood up again, tapping his glass for attention. He looked flushed, victorious, a man who believed he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He didn't look like a man who was broke. He looked like an emperor. Brian stood next to him. My son. He looked less like an emperor and more like a court jester, smiling nervously, nodding at everything his father-in-law said. He was a puppet, and Richard was pulling the strings with hands that were greasy with my money. Friends, family, distinguished guests. Richard bellowed, his voice amplified by the sound system I had paid for. I want to propose a toast, not just to the happy couple, but to the future, to the new era of the Harrington legacy. He paused for effect, looking around the room, soaking in the adoration of people who had no idea he was spending stolen money. You know, Richard continued, swirling the golden liquid in his glass. In business, as in life, you have to be bold. You have to seize opportunities when they present themselves. And I am thrilled to announce tonight that thanks to the strategic brilliance of my future son-in-law Brian, we are launching a massive new venture. I leaned closer to the screen. The security room was silent except for the hum of the cooling fans and Richard's voice. We are expanding into the logistics sector, Richard announced proudly. We have secured a prime distribution facility in Nevada, a state-of-the-art complex that will be the cornerstone of our new empire. This is just the beginning. Welcome to the Harrington Renaissance. The room erupted in applause. I watched Brian. I watched for a flinch. I watched for a sign of guilt. That was my warehouse. That was my land. That was the Sector 4 complex he had mortgaged behind my back. And there he was, letting Richard Harrington claim it as his own. Brian was clapping too. He was clapping for his own theft. He was clapping for the destruction of his father's company. It was a feast of vultures. They were picking my bones clean while I was still alive, and they were congratulating each other on the meal. I looked down at the silver gift box in my hands. Inside was the cashier's check for $500,000. A gift. A blessing. A father's love in paper form. I opened the box. I took out the check. I looked at the numbers. 5, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. I thought about the hours I had worked to earn that money. The winters spent on freezing scaffolding. The summers sweating in trenches. The missed birthdays. The late nights. I had saved that money to ensure my son would never have to struggle the way I did. And he had taken that sacrifice and thrown it in the mud for a round of applause from a room full of strangers. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the check in half. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. I put the two halves together and tore them again, and again, until the $500,000 was nothing but confetti. I let the pieces fall onto the desk of the security console. They looked like snow. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt lighter. The burden of trying to buy their love, of trying to be good enough for them was gone. But I couldn't go out there empty-handed. A guest should always bring a gift, and a creditor should always bring an invoice. I looked around the desk. I saw a printed dinner menu that Garcia had left there earlier. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold embossed lettering. The Gilded Oak Rehearsal Dinner. I flipped it over to the blank side. I took my gold fountain pen from my inside pocket. I uncapped it. I placed the cardstock on the desk and began to write. My hand was steady. My handwriting was bold and jagged, the handwriting of a man who used blueprints, not spreadsheets. I wrote 3 lines. Line 1, repayment of unauthorized loan, $2 million. Line 2, venue rental and catering fees, $150,000. Line 3, termination of employment, effective immediately. I signed it at the bottom. Thomas Sullivan, Chairman. I blew on the ink to dry it. It wasn't a check. It was a declaration of war. It was a bill of sale for their souls. I placed the card into the velvet-lined silver box where the check used to be. It fit perfectly. I looked up at the screen one last time. Richard was drinking his champagne. Tiffany was whispering something to her mother, probably calculating how quickly they could spend the money they thought they were getting. Brian was shaking hands with the senator, looking like he belonged. They looked so comfortable, so safe. They thought the walls of the Gilded Oak were protecting them. They didn't realize the walls belonged to me. I stood up. I buttoned my suit jacket. I adjusted my cuffs. I checked my tie. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. I didn't see a construction worker. I didn't see a retired old man. I saw a storm. Garcia was standing by the door watching me. He had seen me tear the check. He had seen me write the note. He didn't say a word, but his posture was straighter, his jaw set. He was ready. "Garcia," I said, my voice low and devoid of any emotion. "Yes, Mr. Sullivan. Do not let anyone leave through the service exits. Lock them down." "Done, sir." "And Garcia." "Yes, sir, kill the music. It is showtime." Garcia nodded and reached for the master audio fader. I stepped out of the security room and into the service corridor. I could hear the jazz band playing a lively, upbeat number. It sounded like a celebration. As I walked down the hall, the music suddenly warped, slowed down, and then cut out completely with a sharp electronic hiss. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. I could hear the confused murmur of the crowd through the walls. I pushed open the double doors leading to the stage. The bright lights of the ballroom hit me, but I didn't blink. I stepped out from the wings, the silver box in my hand, walking onto the stage like a ghost returning to haunt the living. Richard Harrington was still holding his glass, his mouth open mid-laugh. He froze when he saw me. The senator lowered his drink. Tiffany dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the china. And Brian, my son. He looked at me, and for a second, he looked like that little boy in the hard hat again. But then the fear took over. Pure, unadulterated terror. Because he knew. He knew the man walking toward him wasn't the dad who signed permission slips. It was the man who poured concrete over his problems. I walked to the center of the stage. The house lights were blinding, but I could see them all. Every single one of them. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it was painful, until they were squirming in their seats. I looked directly at Richard Harrington. "I heard you were toasting to your new empire, Richard," I said, my voice booming without a microphone in the dead silent room. I thought I would come down here and personally collect the rent. I stood center stage under the unforgiving glare of the house lights, looking down at the people who had spent the last 3 hours drinking my wine and laughing at my expense. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was not the respectful silence of an audience waiting for a speech. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a disaster unfolding in real time. A few moments ago, this room had been filled with the warm glow of candlelight and the soft hum of jazz. Now stripped of the ambiance, it looked exactly like what it was. A room full of strangers eating food they did not pay for, hosted by a fraud who was drowning in debt. I locked eyes with Richard Harrington. He was still standing, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth, the champagne flute tilting dangerously. His face had gone from a flush of victory to a pale, waxen mask of shock. He looked at me as if I were a corpse that had climbed out of its grave to crash his party. Beside him, the senator lowered his glass, his politician's instincts kicking in, sensing that the wind had just changed direction violently. I did not say a word. I just let them look at me. I let them see the custom charcoal suit that fit me perfectly. I let them see the silk tie. I let them see the silver gift box in my hand. But mostly, I let them see my face. I wasn't the smiling, accommodating father they were used to. I wasn't the quiet old man who sat in the corner at Thanksgiving. I was the man who had negotiated contracts with unions and city councils. I was the man who had fired incompetent foremen without blinking. I was the man who built things that lasted and destroyed things that were structurally unsound. Tiffany was the first to break the silence. She stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, a screeching sound that made half the room wince. She looked deranged. Her perfect bridal makeup was contorted by a mixture of entitlement and fury. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "Who let him in? Brian, do something! He is ruining everything!" She pointed a manicured finger at me, her hand shaking with rage. "This is a private event. You are trespassing. Get security. Get him out of here right now." I looked at Brian. My son. He was sitting next to her, but he looked like he was shrinking physically. He was staring at the white tablecloth, wishing he could dissolve into the fabric. He knew. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew that the silver box in my hand didn't contain a check anymore. He knew that his house of cards wasn't just falling down, it was being incinerated. Brian Tiffany hissed, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Why are you just sitting there? Tell him to leave." Brian didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the weight of his own betrayal. Richard Harrington recovered his voice then. He puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his dignity in front of the VIPs he was trying to impress. He slammed his glass down on the table, splashing champagne onto the expensive linens. "Security!" Richard bellowed, waving his arm frantically toward the back of the room. "Where is security? Remove this man immediately. He is a senile old fool who has wandered in off the street. He is disturbing my guests." The murmurs began then. The guests were whispering, looking back and forth between the angry father of the bride and the calm, imposing figure on the stage. They were confused. They thought this was some sort of skit, or perhaps a family dispute gone wrong. They didn't understand that they were witnessing an execution. "I heard you didn't want me here, Richard," I said. My voice was calm, but it projected to the back of the room without effort. "I heard you thought I wasn't classy enough to sit at your table." Richard's face turned a deep, ugly shade of red. "I don't know how you got past the gate, Tom, but you are leaving now. You are embarrassing your son. Look at him. You are humiliating him on his wedding weekend." I looked at Brian again. He finally looked up, his eyes wet with tears of terror. "I am not the one humiliating him, Richard," I said. "I am the one saving him from a lifetime of being your ATM." That was the last straw for Richard. He turned to the side of the room where a group of uniformed men had just entered through the double doors. These were not the hired security guards from the front gate. These were my men, the internal security team for the Gilded Oak, men I had hired, men I had trained, men who knew exactly who signed their paychecks. "Officers," Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Arrest that man! He is trespassing! Drag him off this stage and throw him in the street!" The guests gasped. The senator looked ready to crawl under the table. Tiffany was smirking now, arms crossed, waiting to see me manhandled and humiliated. She wanted to see the old bricklayer thrown out with the trash. The 4 guards marched down the center aisle. Their boots thudded heavily on the floor in perfect unison. They didn't look at the guests. They didn't look at Richard. They walked with a purpose that made the air in the room feel thin. Richard smiled. He thought they were coming for me. He thought his command held weight because he was wearing a tuxedo and standing at the head table. He didn't realize that in this building, his voice was nothing more than noise. The guards reached the stage. They walked up the stairs, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. Richard's smile widened. "Get him out of here," Richard sneered. But the guards didn't grab me. They didn't touch me. Instead, they walked past me and turned around to face the crowd. They formed a protective semicircle behind me, their arms crossed over their chests, their faces stony and impassive. They weren't there to remove me. They were there to enforce my will. They were my Praetorian Guard. The smile slid off Richard's face like sludge. Tiffany's smirk vanished. The room went deadly silent again. I took a step forward. "I am sorry to disappoint you, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was pure steel. "But you seem to be confused about how property rights work in this country. You see, you cannot evict the landlord." "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his voice losing its boom. "I rented this hall. I paid the deposit." "You paid nothing," I corrected him. "You haven't paid a bill in this city since 2010. Garcia stepped out from the wings then. He was holding a wireless microphone. He walked to the center of the stage, his posture upright and dignified. He stopped next to me and handed me the microphone, but before he stepped back, he turned to address the stunned audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Garcia announced, his voice ringing through the speakers, crisp and professional. I apologize for the disruption to your dinner. However, protocol at the Gilded Oak requires that when the chairman of the board is present, he be recognized. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I saw the senator's eyes go wide. I saw the CEO of Nexus Corp lean forward, sudden recognition dawning on his face. It is my distinct honor, Garcia continued, to introduce to you the sole owner of the Gilded Oak, the proprietor of this land, and the founder of Sullivan and Company. Mr. Thomas Sullivan. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Sullivan and Company. In this state, that name meant infrastructure. It meant skyscrapers. It meant power. And for the Harringtons, it meant the end of the world. Tiffany looked at me, her mouth hanging open. She looked at Brian. You said he was a construction worker, she shrieked. You said he was a nobody. Brian put his head in his hands. Richard Harrington collapsed into his chair as if his strings had been cut. He looked at the walls of the club, the expensive chandeliers, the marble floors. He realized finally that he had been insulting the king in his own castle. I raised the microphone to my lips. I heard you were worried about appearances, I said to the room. I heard you didn't want a blue-collar man ruining your aesthetic. Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is you are right. I am a builder. My hands are dirty. I held up my hand, showing the calluses to the room. The bad news? I continued, my eyes drilling into Richard, is that I am only person in this room who has the power to decide who stays and who goes. And frankly, I don't like the company I am keeping. I stood there, the microphone cool in my hand, watching the realization wash over the room like a cold tide. The silence was no longer stunned. It was expectant. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I was holding a whole boot factory. I looked at the senator, a man whose campaign I had donated to quietly for years. I looked at the CEO of Nexus Corp. They were uncomfortable. They knew something smelled rotten, but they didn't know the source. I was about to show them the carcass. Richard, I said, my voice conversational, almost pleasant. You were just telling these good people about your new venture, about the expansion, about the Harrington legacy. It sounded very impressive, very expensive. Richard was trying to shrink into his chair, his face slick with sweat. He dabbed at his forehead with a napkin, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. But you know, I continued, pacing slowly across the stage. In my line of work, before we pour a foundation, we do a soil test. We check to see if the ground is solid enough to hold the weight. And Richard, I have to tell you, your ground isn't just soft. It is a sinkhole. I raised my hand and pointed to the massive projection screen behind the head table. It was currently displaying a looped slideshow of engagement photos. Brian and Tiffany on a beach. Brian and Tiffany on a yacht that I knew Richard had rented for an hour just for the photo op. It was a montage of a lie. Garcia, I said into the microphone, let us show the guests the real portfolio. Change the feed. The screen flickered. The smiling faces of my son and his bride vanished. In their place, a document appeared. It was stark white and covered in red stamps. It was blown up to 10 feet tall, impossible to miss. Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't a wedding photo. It was a foreclosure notice. This, I said, pointing to the screen, is the deed to the Harrington estate, the ancestral home. As you can see from the date stamp in the corner, proceedings began 6 months ago. Richard has not made a mortgage payment since 2021. Richard jumped up, knocking his chair over. Turn it off, he screamed, his voice cracking. This is a violation of privacy. I will sue you. I ignored him. Next slide. Garcia. The image changed. This time it was a credit card statement. A very long, very red credit card statement. American Express, I read aloud. Balance due $84,000. Status collections. And look at the charges. The Four Seasons, Cartier, DraftKings. It seems the Harrington legacy is being funded by high-interest debt and online gambling. The senator stood up. He picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, and threw it on the table. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Richard," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "You told me you were liquid. You told me my investment was secured by real estate assets." "It is," Richard stammered, reaching out a hand. "Senator, please. This is a misunderstanding. This man is vindictive. He is doctoring the files." "I am not doctoring anything." "Richard," I said. "I am auditing." Next slide. The screen changed again. This was the one that made the room go cold. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a police report from Atlantic City. It detailed an incident involving unpaid markers at a casino and a subsequent altercation. But attached to it was a promissory note, a note signed by Richard Harrington to a private lending entity that didn't have a website or a Better Business Bureau rating. "You see, folks," I said, addressing the room, "Richard didn't just borrow from banks. Banks have rules. Banks say no. So Richard went to the kind of lenders who don't ask for credit scores. They ask for collateral in kneecaps. That is a $200,000 loan from what the police politely call an unbanked entity. That is loan shark money, Richard. And it was due last week." Tiffany let out a sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, looking at her father with horror. She didn't know about this part. She knew they were broke, but she didn't know they were dangerous broke. She didn't know her daddy was gambling with blood money. "That is why you needed my check tonight, isn't it?" I asked, looking down at him. "You weren't going to invest it. You were going to use my life savings to save your own skin. You were going to wash your dirty laundry with my son's inheritance." The room was in motion now. The VIPs were not waiting for dessert. The CEO of Nexus Corp was already halfway to the door, talking furiously into his cell phone, probably canceling whatever deal he had made with Richard. The senator was ushering his wife out, not even looking back. The illusion of power and prestige had shattered, leaving only the ugly, desperate reality of a con artist caught in the act. Richard looked around the room. He saw his audience leaving. He saw his social standing evaporating. He saw the end of his life as he knew it. He panicked. He grabbed his chest. He let out a strangled cry. "Oh God," he moaned. "My heart. I can't breathe." He collapsed onto the floor. It was a theatrical fall, a little too slow, a little too controlled. He landed on the expensive rug, clutching his tuxedo shirt, gasping for air. Daddy Tiffany screamed, rushing to his side. She fell to her knees. "Somebody help him! Call 911! He is having a heart attack!" Cynthia was fanning him with a menu, looking around wildly. "You killed him!" she shrieked at me. "You killed my husband!" The room hesitated. Even the people leaving stopped. A heart attack was serious. A heart attack demanded sympathy. I watched from the stage. I didn't move. I didn't call for a medic. I just watched Richard writhing on the floor, putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Garcia," I said calmly into the microphone, "do not call an ambulance." The room turned to look at me. I saw shock on their faces. They thought I was a monster. They thought I was letting a man die. I walked down the stairs from the stage. I walked slowly, deliberately, until I was standing right over Richard. He was groaning, his eyes squeezed shut, but I noticed his color was fine. He wasn't sweating. His breathing was rhythmic, not erratic. "Get up, Richard," I said. My voice was flat, cold. He groaned louder. "My chest," he whispered. "The pain." I leaned down close to his ear, but I kept the microphone near my mouth so everyone could hear. "I know you are faking it, Richard, and I know why. You think an ambulance ride will get you out of here without having to answer any more questions. You think a hospital bed is a sanctuary." I stood up straight and addressed the room. His health insurance policy with Blue Cross was canceled 45 days ago for non-payment, I announced. I saw the notice in his file. If you call an ambulance now, Richard, they will take you to the county hospital. And since you have no coverage and no credit, they will stabilize you and bill you. And when they realize you are faking it, they will discharge you right into the waiting arms of the police officers my lawyer just called. Richard's groans stopped abruptly. His eyes snapped open. He looked up at me, and the hate in his eyes was pure and unmasked. He realized his escape hatch had been welded shut. The performance ended. He scrambled to his feet, dusting off his tuxedo, his face flushing with humiliation. The guests who had stayed to watch the drama now looked at him with utter contempt. Faking a heart attack was a new low even for him. "You are a monster," Richard spat at me. "No, Richard," I said. "I am just the auditor. And the audit is finished. You are bankrupt. You are a fraud. And you are trespassing on my property." I turned my back on him. He wasn't worth another second of my time. He was a ghost, a bad memory. I turned my attention to the person who actually mattered, the person whose betrayal cut deeper than any unpaid bill. I walked over to the table where my son was sitting. Brian hadn't moved. He hadn't gone to help his father-in-law. He hadn't tried to leave. He was frozen in his chair, staring at me with the eyes of a deer watching the headlights of a semi-truck getting closer and closer. He looked small. He looked weak. He looked exactly like the kind of man who would steal from his father because he was too scared to work for himself. "Hello, Brian," I said softly. He looked up at me, his lip trembling. "Dad," he whispered. "I can explain." I shook my head. "No explanations, son. We are way past explanations. We are in the numbers phase now. And your numbers do not add up." I reached into the silver box and pulled out the file Ben had sent me. The evidence of the warehouse mortgage. The forgery. The theft. "And you, my precious son," I said, dropping the heavy file onto the table in front of him with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. "You have a lot of accounting to do." The file hit the table with a heavy final thud that seemed to shake the silverware. It sat there between us, a thick stack of papers bound with a metal clip looking innocuous, but containing enough legal dynamite to level a skyscraper. Brian stared at it. He didn't want to touch it. He looked like a man who had just been handed a live grenade with the pin pulled. "Open it," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a density to it that made disobedience impossible. "Open it, Brian. Read the title of the first document out loud so your new family knows exactly what you brought to the marriage." Brian's hand shook violently as he reached out. He flipped the cover open. His eyes darted across the page, widening with every line. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Affidavit of forgery," he whispered. Louder, I commanded. "Affidavit of forgery," he said, his voice cracking, "regarding the commercial mortgage of the Sector 4 distribution complex." "That is right," I said, leaning over the table, placing my hands flat on the white linen. $2 million, Brian. $2 million. You stole the deed to my most valuable property. You forged my digital signature. You mortgaged the ground under my feet. And for what? To pay off your father-in-law's gambling debts. To buy a seat at a table where you were the main course. I looked at Tiffany. She was staring at the file, her mind racing, calculating the damage. She wasn't looking at Brian with concern. She wasn't worried about his legal trouble. She was worried about the math. "You told me he signed it over," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with venom. "You told me the transfer was legal. You said we had the equity. I thought I could fix it," Brian stammered, looking between me and her, desperate for an ally, and finding none. "I was going to pay it back, Dad. I swear. Once the investment paid off." "There was no investment, Brian," I roared, slamming my fist onto the table. The sudden violence of the movement made him flinch back. "There was no business venture. There was only a black hole of debt called Richard Harrington. You threw my money into a fire, hoping it would keep you warm. You stole from the man who raised you to feed the man who despises you. I reached into the box and pulled out another sheet of paper. It was a printout of the wire transfer. Look at the beneficiary, Brian. RH Ventures, a shell company. You didn't even try to hide it. You were so arrogant, so sure that I was just a senile old bricklayer who wouldn't notice a $2 million hole in his ledger. You thought I was stupid. No, Dad, never, Brian cried, tears streaming down his face now. I wanted to be someone. I wanted to be on their level. You wanted to be on their level, I repeated, gesturing to Richard, who was still dusting off his knees, looking sullen and trapped. Well, congratulations, son. You made it. You are a fraud. You are a liar, and you are broke. You fit right in. Brian slid out of his chair. He didn't stand up. He sank down. He fell to his knees on the hardwood floor of the stage right in front of me. He grabbed the hem of my jacket, clutching the fabric, like a drowning man clutching a rope. It was a pathetic sight. My son, the director, the MBA, the future of my company groveling on the floor in a tuxedo that I paid for. Dad, please, he sobbed. I am sorry. I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just don't do this. Don't ruin me. I looked down at him. I tried to find a spark of pity in my heart. I tried to remember the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after a long day. But all I could see was the man who had laughed while calling me incompetent. All I could see was the signature on the mortgage documents that put my employees' livelihoods at risk. You ruined yourself, Brian, I said coldly, pulling my jacket from his grip. You did this. Every signature, every lie, every stolen dollar. That was you. You built this prison brick by brick, and now you have to live in it. Tiffany stood up slowly. She looked down at Brian, who was weeping at my feet. The look on her face was not one of heartbreak. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look one gives to a piece of meat that has gone rotten. She realized in that moment that the golden ticket she thought she had punched was void. There was no inheritance. There was no warehouse. There was no prestige. There was only a crying man who was about to be a felon. You are pathetic, Tiffany spat. Her voice was ice cold. You lied to me. You said you were a partner. You said you controlled the assets. You are nothing but a thief. Brian looked up at her, his face streaked with tears and snot. Tiff, please. We can figure this out. She laughed a harsh, ugly sound. There is no we. I am not marrying an embezzler. I am not marrying a man who has to beg his daddy for mercy on his knees. My mother was right. You are trash. She turned her back on him. She didn't even look at me. She just walked away, stepping over the train of her wedding dress, heading for the exit, without a backward glance. The room was silent, save for Brian's jagged breathing. The guests who remained were frozen, witnessing the total disintegration of a family. It was a tragedy, but it was a necessary one. The rot had to be cut out. And then cutting through the silence came the sound I had been waiting for. Sirens. At first it was a distant wail rising and falling in the night air. Then it grew louder, closer, more insistent. Blue and red lights began to flash against the high windows of the ballroom, casting chaotic shadows across the floor. The cavalry had arrived. The double doors at the back of the room burst open. But it wasn't a waiter. It wasn't a guest. It was Ben Stone. My lawyer. He looked grim, his face set in a hard line. He was carrying a briefcase in one hand and a stack of files in the other. Flanking him were 2 uniformed police officers and 2 men in plain suits who had the distinct, serious look of economic crimes detectives. Ben walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look left or right. He walked straight to the stage. He walked straight to me. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked at Brian, who was still kneeling, his head bowed in defeat. Ben sighed a sound of deep regret, but he didn't hesitate. He looked up at me and nodded. "It is done, Tom," Ben said quietly. The judge signed the warrant. The bank confirmed the forgery. I nodded back. "Thank you, Ben." The metallic ratchet of the handcuffs tightening around my son's wrists was a sound that seemed to suck the remaining air out of the ballroom. It was a cold, mechanical finality that cut through the sobbing and the murmurs of the few staff members who had remained to witness the collapse of the Harrington empire. I watched from my position on the stage, my hands clasped behind my back, feeling a weight in my chest that was heavier than any steel beam I had ever lifted. This was the moment I had engineered, the moment justice arrived, but it did not taste sweet. It tasted like ash. Detective Miller, a man I had known for years, a man who respected the law as much as I respected a blueprint, stepped forward to formalize the nightmare. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the two men who were now the property of the state. He pulled a small laminated card from his pocket, though I knew he had recited these words 1,000 times. Richard Harrington Miller said, his voice flat and professional. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard was not silent. He was babbling a stream of desperate, nonsensical denials that spilled from his lips like water from a broken pipe. He looked at the officers, then at me, then at the empty tables where his prestigious guests had been sitting just minutes ago. "This is a mistake," Richard wheezed, sweat dripping from his nose onto his ruined tuxedo shirt. "I am a respected member of this community. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. You cannot do this to me. I demand to speak to my attorney." "You can call your attorney from the station," Miller said, nodding to his partner. The second officer grabbed Richard by the arm. The man who had strutted onto this stage an hour ago claiming to own the world stumbled. His legs gave out, not from a heart attack this time, but from the crushing reality that his charade was over. He had to be half-carried, his expensive shoes dragging across the polished floor he had trespassed on. Then Miller turned to Brian. My son was still on his knees, his head bowed, the tears dripping onto the hardwood floor. He looked so young in that moment, stripped of his arrogance, stripped of his title, stripped of the false confidence he had stolen from my bank account. Brian Sullivan Miller continued, "You are under arrest for embezzlement, forgery of a financial instrument, and identity theft." Brian didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just let out a low, keen sound, a sound of pure misery. He held his hands out behind him obediently, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life, the moment when the imposter was finally unmasked. Dad, Brian whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Dad, please." I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I spoke now, I would break, and I needed to be stone. I needed to be the foundation that remained when the house fell down. But the destruction wasn't finished yet. There was one more pillar that needed to crumble. Tiffany Harrington had been standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching the arrest with eyes that were wide and unblinking. She looked like a statue of a bride frozen in time. She watched her father being dragged away. She watched her fiancé being read his rights, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. I could see the frantic calculations she was making. She looked at the empty ballroom. She looked at the foreclosure notice that was still frozen on the giant screen behind me. She looked at the invoice I had written. And then she looked at Brian. She didn't see a man she loved. She didn't see a partner in life. She saw a failed investment. She saw a liability. She saw a man who had promised her a life of ease and luxury, and who was now offering her a future of prison visits and bankruptcy hearings. She walked toward him. Her movement was stiff, robotic. Her white dress rustled softly, a ghostly sound in the quiet room. Brian looked up at her. Hope flared in his eyes, a desperate, pathetic hope. He thought she was coming to comfort him. He thought that in this darkest moment, the woman he had stolen $2 million for would stand by his side. Tiff. Brian choked out. I am so sorry. I can fix this. I promise. Tiffany stopped 2 feet away from him. She looked down at him with a gaze that could have frozen the sun. Fix it. She repeated, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with a rage so intense it was almost impressive. How are you going to fix it, Brian? You are going to prison. It is a mistake, Brian pleaded. My dad, he will drop the charges. He loves me. Tiffany laughed. It was a sharp barking sound that had no humor in it. He hates you, Brian. He hates you because you are a thief. And I hate you because you are a liar. She reached for her left hand. She grabbed the diamond engagement ring, the ring Brian had bought with a credit card I had paid off 3 times. She yanked it off her finger. You told me you were a partner, she screamed. Her composure shattering completely. You told me you ran the company. You told me you had millions in assets. You sat there at dinner and let my parents brag about your money when you knew you were nothing but a glorified secretary stealing from his daddy. Tiffany, please, Brian sobbed. I did it for us. For us, she shrieked. There is no us. I am a Harrington. We might be broke, but we are not felons. I am not going to be the wife of a convict. I am not going to wait for you. She drew her arm back and threw the ring. It hit Brian square in the forehead, a hard metallic impact that left a red mark instantly. The diamond bounced off his face and skittered across the floor, spinning and sparkling under the harsh house lights until it came to rest near my feet. You are a fraud, Tiffany spat. You are a loser, and you are poor. That is the worst part, Brian. You are poor. She turned around, her veil whipping through the air. She didn't look at her mother, who was weeping silently at a table. She didn't look at her father, who was being hauled out the side door. She just walked away. She walked toward the main exit, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of abandonment. She was cutting her losses. She was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, and she didn't care who drowned, as long as she stayed dry. Brian watched her go. His body slumped. The last bit of fight left him. He was alone. Truly, completely alone. The officers pulled him to his feet. He stumbled, his legs numb. They began to march him toward the exit, following the path Tiffany had just taken. They had to walk past the stage. They had to walk past me. I stepped down from the platform. I walked until I was standing right in front of the path they had to take. Detective Miller held up a hand, signaling the officers to stop. He gave me a moment. He knew this was the goodbye. Brian looked at me. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a pain that was difficult to witness. Dad, he whispered. Why? Why are you doing this? I am your son. I looked at him. I looked at the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. I looked at the tuxedo that I had paid for. I looked at the son I had loved so much that I had blinded myself to his flaws for 30 years. I didn't do this, Brian, I said softly. You did this. You signed the papers. You stole the money. You chose them over me. But prison, Dad, he cried. Prison. I took a step closer to him. I was close enough to smell the expensive cologne he was wearing and the smell of fear that was sweating through it. I can buy this building, Brian, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was breaking inside my chest. I can buy the land. I can buy the steel and the glass. I can buy the judges and the senators. I can buy anything in this world that has a price tag. I paused, letting the words sink in. But I cannot buy you character, I said. I cannot buy you integrity. I cannot buy you a spine. I tried. God knows I tried. I gave you everything. I gave you the easy road, and it made you weak. It made you a thief. I leaned in, looking deep into his eyes. You have to learn that in prison, son. You have to learn the value of $1 and the value of a name in a place where you can't borrow either of them. You have to build yourself from the ground up because the house I built for you, you burned it down. Brian stared at me. For the first time tonight, I saw something other than fear in his eyes. I saw understanding. It was a terrible, crushing understanding, but it was real. He realized that the safety net was gone. He was falling, and he was going to hit the ground. I love you, Brian, I said, my voice thick with emotion. That is why I am letting you fall. I nodded to Detective Miller. Take him. Miller gave a subtle nod to his officers. They gripped Brian's arms and began to move him forward. Brian didn't scream anymore. He didn't beg. He just walked his head down, dragging his feet toward the flashing blue lights that awaited him outside. I watched him go. I watched my only son being led away in handcuffs from his own wedding rehearsal. I watched until the double doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the view. I was alone in the ballroom. The silence returned heavier than before. I looked around the room. It was a graveyard of extravagance. The tables were still set with fine china and crystal. The flowers were still blooming in their centerpieces, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded around them. Half-eaten plates of food sat cooling under the lights. The champagne was going flat in the glasses. It was a waste. A colossal, expensive, beautiful waste. I saw the diamond ring lying on the floor near the stage. I walked over and picked it up. It was heavy. It was cold. It represented a promise that had been broken before it was ever made. I put the ring in my pocket. I would return it to the jewelry store on Monday. I would get a refund. Because unlike the Harringtons, I paid my debts and I collected my returns. Garcia appeared from the shadows of the wings. He walked over to me, and his face somber. The police have cleared the building, Mr. Sullivan, Garcia said quietly. The guests are gone. The staff is waiting for instructions. I looked at the room one last time. I looked at the banner hanging over the head table that read, Brian and Tiffany forever. Tear it down, Garcia, I said. Tear it all down. Clear the tables. Donate the food to the homeless shelter downtown. Send the flowers to the hospital. And the bill, Sir Garcia asked. For the damages, for the cancellation. Send it to me, I said. I will pay it. I always pay. I turned and walked toward the exit. I felt old. I felt tired. My feet hurt in my expensive shoes. But as I walked, I felt something else, too. I felt lighter. The lie was over. The charade was finished. I walked out into the cool night air. The police cars were gone. The parking lot was empty except for my old Ford truck parked in the owner's spot. I climbed into the cab. It smelled of dust and hard work. I started the engine. I didn't look back at the Gilded Oak. I drove down the winding driveway past the security gate and out onto the open road. I was going home, to my empty house, to my quiet life. But it was an honest life. And for the first time in a long time, it was mine again. The visiting room at the county detention center smelled of industrial bleach and stale fear. It was a sensory world away from the lavender and expensive cologne of the Gilded Oak, yet the distance between the two places was only a 20-minute drive. I sat on a bolted-down steel stool, my hands resting on the cold metal table, waiting. I had been here before visiting foremen who got into bar fights, or subcontractors who cut corners, but never for my own blood. The heavy steel door on the other side of the glass partition buzzed and clanked open. A guard led a man into the room. For a second, I did not recognize him. The man was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His hair, usually styled with expensive gel, was greasy and matted against his forehead. His face was gray, covered in a week of patchy stubble, and his eyes were sunken into dark, bruised hollows. It was Brian. In just 7 days, the jail had stripped away the director of operations and left only the frightened boy beneath. He sat down slowly, wincing as the handcuffs clicked against the table. He picked up the phone receiver on the wall. I did the same. For a long minute, we just looked at each other through the scratched plexiglass. I searched for the son I had raised, the boy I had taught to fish, but all I saw was a stranger who had tried to bankrupt me. "Are you happy now?" Brian asked. His voice was raspy dry. It sounded like scraping sandpaper. "Is this what you wanted? To see me like this? In a cage?" I did not flinch. I did not offer sympathy. Sympathy was what got us here in the first place. "I do not want you here, Brian," I said calmly. "I wanted you in your office running the logistics division. I wanted you building a life. You are the one who chose to rob the bank instead of running it. You humiliated me." Brian snapped, a flash of his old anger sparking in his eyes. "You destroyed my wedding. You destroyed my life in front of everyone I know. You could have handled this privately. You could have covered the loan. You have the money. You have millions. What was $2 million to you? Nothing. But you had to make a show of it. You are cruel, Dad. You are a sadistic, cruel old man." I leaned in closer to the glass. The accusation hung in the air between us. "Cruel. You think I am cruel?" I asked. "Let me tell you what cruel is. Cruel is letting a man believe he is a king while he is standing on a trapdoor. Cruel is letting you marry a woman who only wanted you for a warehouse deed. Cruel would have been letting you get away with it. If I had covered that loan, Brian," I continued, my voice steady, "you would have done it again. And again. You would have drained the company dry until 500 families lost their jobs. You would have ended up in federal prison for 20 years instead of county jail." I stopped the bleeding. It hurt, yes. Amputations always hurt, but they save the patient. Brian slumped back, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a crushing defeat. "It does not matter," he whispered. "My life is over anyway." Ben Stone came to see me yesterday. He said the district attorney is pushing for grand larceny and corporate fraud. He said I am looking at 15 years. Minimum. He looked at me, tears welling up in his eyes. 15 years, Dad. I will be almost 50 when I get out. I will have nothing. That is why I am here, I said. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it and pressed it against the glass so he could read it. It was a plea agreement. "I spoke to the district attorney this morning," I said, "and I spoke to Ben. We have come to an arrangement. But it depends entirely on you." Brian squinted at the paper. "What is this?" he asked. "I am withdrawing the request for maximum sentencing," I explained. "I am classifying the $2 million not as a theft, but as an unauthorized executive withdrawal, provided that full restitution is made immediately. If you agree to the terms, the DA will drop the fraud charges down to a lesser count. You will serve 18 months, maybe 12 with good behavior." Brian's eyes widened. 12 months. It was a lifeline. It was a miracle. 12 months, he breathed. "You would do that?" "I am not finished," I said sharply. "There are conditions. Severe conditions." I pulled the paper back and folded it. "First, full restitution. That means I am liquidating everything you own. The downtown condo is already on the market. The Audi is being sold this afternoon. Your investment accounts, your 401k, your watch collection. Everything goes back into the company accounts to cover the hole you dug. You leave here with the clothes on your back and not a penny more." Brian nodded frantically. "Take it. Take it all." "I do not care." Second, I continued. "You are fired." "Obviously. You are banned from Sullivan and Company premises. You will never hold an executive position in my company again, and you are disinherited." Brian froze. Disinherited. "I am rewriting my will this afternoon," I said. "The trust fund, the future shares the estate. It is all gone. You are out of the will, Brian. Until you prove to me that you can build a life with your own hands, you get nothing." "But Dad," Brian stammered, "how am I supposed to live? When I get out, I will be a felon. I will have no home, no car, no money." "Exactly," I said. "You will be exactly where I was when I started this company 40 years ago. You will be at zero." I looked at him, and for the first time I let the mask slip. I let him see the pain in my eyes. "I gave you everything, Brian. I gave you the elevator ride to the top floor. And you didn't respect the view because you didn't have to climb the stairs. Now you have to climb." "But where will I go?" he asked, his voice small and terrified. "I heard they are hiring laborers at the rail yard," I said. "It is hard work, honest work. It pays minimum wage. It builds character." "You want me to work at the rail yard?" Brian asked, incredulous. "I want you to learn the value of $1, I said. "I want you to understand that money represents sweat, not magic. I want you to become a man, Brian. Not a director, not an heir, a man." Brian stared at the table. He was trembling. He was realizing the magnitude of the mountain he now had to climb. He wasn't just losing his freedom for a year. He was losing his identity. He was losing the soft, cushioned world he had always known. Why, he whispered, "Why not just let me go? Why strip me of everything?" "Because I love you," I said. He looked up, shocked. "You think this is hate?" I said. "Hate would be bailing you out and letting you turn into Richard Harrington. Hate would be letting you live a lie until it destroyed you completely." "This is love, Brian. This is the hardest thing I have ever done. I am breaking you down so you can build yourself back up, and this time you will use your own bricks." I stood up. My knees popped. I felt every day of my 70 years. "Ben will be here in an hour with the paperwork," I said. "Sign the plea. Do your time. Keep your head down. Read some books. Think about who you want to be when you walk out those doors." I turned to leave. "Dad," Brian called out. I stopped my hand on the heavy steel door. I didn't turn around. "Will you be there?" he asked. "When I get out." I paused. I thought about the empty house waiting for me. I thought about the silence. "That depends on who walks out." "Brian," I said, "if it is my son, I will be there. If it is a thief, the door will be locked." I pushed the door open and walked out into the corridor. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I might have turned around. I might have tried to save him again. And saving him would be the worst thing I could do. I walked out of the detention center and into the bright, blinding sunlight of the parking lot. I took a deep breath of fresh air. It tasted sweet, but it didn't wash away the taste of the jail. I got into my old Ford truck. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I had just sentenced my own son to prison and poverty. I had just destroyed his life to save his soul. I started the engine. The radio came on, playing an old country song about hard times and redemption. It seemed fitting. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the exit. I had one more stop to make. One final piece of business to conclude before I could truly start over. I had a building to sell and a legacy to rebuild. The weeks following Brian's sentencing were the quietest of my life. You might think that silence is peaceful, but when you are living in a house built for a family that no longer exists, silence is heavy. It presses down on your chest like a wet wool blanket. I spent my days dismantling the life my son had built with stolen money. It was a forensic demolition. I hired a team of liquidators to clear out his downtown penthouse. I stood in the corner of his living room, watching strangers pack up his Italian leather sofas, his 70-inch televisions, and the designer suits he wore to board meetings where he didn't do any work. I watched them take his watch collection. There was a Rolex Daytona he had bought the day he forged the mortgage papers. I held it in my hand for a moment. It was heavy, beautiful, and cold. It felt like handcuffs. I handed it to the auctioneer without a word. Every single item was tagged and sold. The proceeds did not go into my pocket. They went directly back into the company accounts to fill the crater he had blasted in our finances. It was not about the money anymore. It was about the principle of restitution. He had to pay back every cent, even if it meant he came out to a world where he owned nothing but the name on his birth certificate. The hardest part wasn't the selling. It was the noise from the outside. The story had hit the papers. Wealthy heir steals millions. Tycoon father presses charges. The tabloids loved it. They painted me as a biblical figure, a vengeful patriarch sacrificing his son on the altar of business. They didn't see the nights I sat awake in my study staring at the phone, fighting the urge to call the best criminal defense lawyer in the state and make it all go away. It would have been so easy. I had the money. I had the connections. I could have pulled strings, claimed it was a misunderstanding, paid off the lenders, and Brian would have walked free with a slap on the wrist. But I knew that if I did that, I would be signing his death warrant. Not his physical death, but the death of his character. If I saved him now, he would never be a man. He would be a permanent child waiting for Daddy to clean up his messes. So I sat on my hands. I let the phone ring. I let the months drag on. About 3 months into his sentence, I had a visitor at my office. My real office at the construction yard, not the glass tower. It was Cynthia Harrington. She arrived in a taxi because the Bentley had been repossessed the week after the wedding disaster. She looked older. The veneer of high society had cracked, revealing the desperate, tired woman underneath. She didn't come to apologize. She came to negotiate. She marched into my office past the secretary and slammed her purse on my desk. She told me that I had ruined her family. She told me that Richard was facing 5 years for fraud and that Tiffany was having a nervous breakdown because her social standing had evaporated. She demanded a settlement. She claimed emotional distress. She claimed that Brian had promised them financial security and that as his father I was liable for his broken promises. I let her scream. I let her vent all the poison that had been festering in her entitled heart. When she was finished panting and red-faced, I opened my desk drawer. I pulled out a single file. It was the dossier Garcia had compiled on their debts. Cynthia. I said, my voice low and steady. You are not a victim here. You were an accomplice. You and your husband saw my son not as a person, but as a host organism. You latched onto him and you sucked him dry. You encouraged him to steal. You celebrated his theft. I pushed the file toward her. My lawyers have drafted a civil complaint naming you and Tiffany as co-conspirators in the embezzlement scheme. I lied. I hadn't filed it yet, but she didn't know that. We have the emails, Cynthia. We have the wire transfers to your shell company. If you want to talk about settlements, we can talk about you joining your husband in federal prison. Or you can walk out that door, never say my name again, and find a job like the rest of us. Cynthia looked at the file. She looked at me. The fight went out of her instantly. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking, and backed out of the office. I never saw her again. It was a small victory, but it felt like cleaning a wound. I was scrubbing away the infection so the healing could finally begin. The holidays were the worst. Christmas Eve came with a biting cold that rattled the windows of my empty house. Usually the house would be full. Brian would be there. There would be a tree music food. This year, there was just me and a bottle of scotch. I sat by the fireplace watching the logs burn down to ash. I thought about Brian in his cell. I wondered if he was warm. I wondered if he had anyone to talk to. I wondered if he hated me. I received a letter from him in January. The envelope was stamped with the seal of the correctional facility. I didn't open it for 3 days. I was afraid of what was inside. I was afraid it would be more begging, more accusations, more manipulation. When I finally worked up the courage to tear it open, I sat at my kitchen table, my reading glasses perched on my nose, bracing myself for the anger. But there was no anger. The letter was short. The handwriting was cramped and messy, written with a dull pencil. "Dear Dad," it read, "I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know I broke everything. I am working in the laundry here. It is hot, and it smells like bleach, but it keeps my hands busy. I think about the warehouse a lot. I think about how you looked at me on that stage. You were right. I was weak. I am trying to get stronger. Do not come visit me. I am not ready to look you in the eye yet. I just wanted you to know that I am paying my dues. Brian." I read that letter until the paper wore thin. It was the first time in his life he hadn't asked me for something. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just acknowledged his debt. It was a small spark in the darkness, but it was enough to keep me going. I went back to work with a renewed ferocity. I threw myself into the business, not the boardroom side of it, but the dirt and concrete side. I needed to reconnect with the source of my wealth. I needed to remind myself and everyone else that Sullivan and Company wasn't built on fraud. It was built on sweat. I visited job sites at 5 in the morning. I drank coffee with the foreman. I inspected welds. I walked the steel beams 60 stories up, feeling the wind bite my face, reminding myself that I was still alive, still capable, still the man who built this city. I was rebuilding my reputation, yes, but I was also preparing the ground. I didn't know if Brian would ever come back to the company. In fact, I was almost certain he shouldn't. But I wanted to make sure that the company still stood for something honorable just in case he ever found his way back to himself. I wanted the name Sullivan to mean something again. Spring turned to summer. The days got longer. I heard rumors about Tiffany Harrington. She had moved to another state looking for a new mark, a new wallet to open. Richard pled guilty and went away to a minimum security camp. The rats had scattered. The wreckage was cleared. And then the call came. It wasn't from Brian. It was from his case manager. He was being released early for good behavior and work credits. He was getting out in August. My heart hammered against my ribs. The test was ending. The real world was waiting for him. I wanted to drive to the gates. I wanted to pick him up. I wanted to bring him home and cook him a steak and tell him it was all over. But I stayed home. I remembered my promise. If I cushioned the landing, the fall wouldn't matter. He had to walk out of those gates alone. He had to find his own ride. He had to find his own food. He had to navigate the world as a man with a record and empty pockets. It was the final exam. I spent that day pacing my living room, checking my watch every 5 minutes. I wondered where he was. I wondered if he was hungry. I wondered if he would come to my door. He didn't come. A week passed, then 2. I hired a private investigator, not to interfere, just to watch, to make sure he wasn't back on drugs or back with the wrong crowd. The report came back a few days later. Brian was living in a halfway house on the south side. He was taking the bus, and he had applied for a job as a general laborer at a construction site run by one of my competitors. He didn't use his last name to get favors. He didn't mention me. He applied as Brian ex-con willing to work. When I read that report, I cried. For the first time since the night of the rehearsal dinner, I let the tears fall. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. He was trying. He was actually trying. That was when I knew I could sell the Gilded Oak. I didn't need the reminder of his failure anymore. I needed to focus on his future, even if I had to watch it from a distance. I needed to let him build his own skyscraper, one brick at a time. I sold the Gilded Oak 3 weeks after Brian went to jail. The ink was barely dry on his plea deal, when I put the for sale sign up on the front lawn. People told me I was crazy. They said it was a cash cow, a landmark, a jewel in the Sullivan crown. They didn't understand. To me, it wasn't a jewel anymore. It was a crime scene. Every time I walked through that lobby, I didn't see the imported marble or the gold leaf detailing I had paid for. I saw my son on his knees begging for his life. I saw Richard Harrington faking a heart attack on the rug. I heard the echo of Tiffany's heels clicking away as she abandoned the man she supposedly loved the moment his wallet ran dry. The building was haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of the worst night of my life. I sold it to a hospitality group from Chicago for $28 million. I didn't haggle. I didn't try to squeeze every last cent out of the deal. I just wanted it gone. I wanted the deed out of my name. When I handed over the keys to the new owners, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was like exhaling after holding my breath for months. But I didn't keep the money. I didn't need another $28 million sitting in a trust fund, gathering dust and attracting vultures who only wanted to be my friend for a loan. I had seen what unearned money did to people. I had seen how it rotted Brian from the inside out, how it turned him into a thief and a liar. So I did something that would have made the old Tom Sullivan, the one who counted every penny and saved receipts for coffee, have a heart attack. I gave it away. I established the Sullivan Builders Fund. It wasn't a fancy charity for art galleries or opera houses where rich people go to feel good about themselves. It was a safety net for the men and women who actually built this country. The bricklayers with bad backs who couldn't work anymore. The electricians with arthritis who couldn't hold a wire strippers. The roofers who fell on hard times after a bad fall. I set up scholarships for trade schools to teach kids that working with your hands is honorable. I paid off medical debts for retired foremen who were drowning in bills. I built affordable housing for veterans. I used the money that had destroyed my family to rebuild the lives of strangers. And for the first time in years, I slept soundly. It is 1 year later now. The calendar says October 14th, the anniversary of the rehearsal dinner, the anniversary of the end of my old life. I am not in an office. I am not in a boardroom wearing a suit. I am standing in ankle-deep mud wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat that has seen better days. I am supervising the construction of a new community center on the east side of the city. It is a small job compared to the skyscrapers and stadiums I used to build, but it feels more important. I like the smell of the wet concrete. I like the sound of the saws cutting through lumber. I like the feeling of the blueprints in my hands gritty with dust. This is where I belong. Not in a tuxedo, but in work clothes. It is noon. The lunch whistle blows, cutting through the noise of the site. The machinery dies down, replaced by the chatter of the crew opening their lunch boxes and finding spots to sit. I lean against the hood of my Ford truck, unwrapping a ham sandwich and unscrewing the cap of my thermos. The coffee is hot and black, just the way I like it. I look across the street. There is another construction site over there, a high-rise luxury condo building going up. It is a massive project, chaotic and loud. I watch the laborers filing out of the gate looking for a spot of shade to eat their lunch. And then I see him. He is sitting on a stack of drywall pallets alone. He is wearing a neon yellow safety vest that is stained with grease and dirt. His boots are scuffed and gray with cement dust. His face is deeply tanned, lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes and mouth. He has lost weight. The soft, doughy look of the corporate executive is gone, replaced by the lean, hard muscle of a man who hauls lumber for 10 hours a day. It is Brian. He got out 2 months ago. He served 10 months of his 12-month sentence. He got out early for good behavior. He didn't call me when he was released. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a job at my company. He just disappeared into the city. I heard through the grapevine that he was working day labor, picking up shifts where he could find them, carrying hod, mixing mortar, sweeping floors. doing the jobs that he used to look down on from his glass office, doing the jobs I started with 50 years ago. I watch him unwrap his lunch. It is not a steak dinner on a white tablecloth. It is a sub sandwich from a gas station wrapped in crinkly foil. He takes a bite, chewing slowly, staring at the ground. He looks tired. He looks beaten. But he also looks real. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. He takes a long drink from a plastic water bottle, and then he looks up. He sees me. The distance between us is only about 50 yards of busy street, but it feels like a canyon. We lock eyes. I stop chewing. I wait for him to look away. I wait for him to glare at me with hatred. I wait for him to shout something, to blame me for his fall, to scream about the inheritance I took away and the prison sentence I handed him. But he doesn't. He holds my gaze. He doesn't smile. There is no joy in his expression. But there is no hate either. There is only recognition. He looks at my boots. He looks at my truck. He looks at the hard hat in my hand. He sees that I am working too. And then Brian nods. It is a small, sharp movement, a single nod of the head. It is the kind of nod one worker gives to another boss at the end of a long shift. It is a nod that says, I see you. It says, I understand. It says, I am tired, my back hurts, my hands are bleeding, but I earned this sandwich. I paid for it with my own sweat. He turns back to his meal. He takes another bite of his cheap lunch. He doesn't look at me again. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My chest feels tight, but it is a good tightness. It is the feeling of a wound finally beginning to close. That nod, that simple, silent gesture. It was worth more than the $2 million he stole. It was worth more than the $500,000 check I tore up. It was the first honest thing my son has done in 10 years. He is learning. He is at the bottom of the mountain, and it is a long, hard climb back up. He might never reach the top again. He might never be a director. He might never be rich. But he is a man now. He is paying his own way. He is sweating for his bread. I saved him. I destroyed his life to save him, and it worked. I cut off the limb to save the body. I finish my coffee. I screw the cap back on the thermos. The whistle blows again. Back to work. I put my hard hat back on. I look across the street one last time, but Brian is already gone back inside the skeleton of the building, back to the grind. I climb into my truck to grab my clipboard. I look at my own hands. They are old. They are scarred. But they are clean. I did my job. I built a legacy. And then I rebuilt my son. It wasn't the way I wanted to do it. It wasn't the dream I had when I held him in the hospital nursery 33 years ago. But life doesn't follow blueprints. Sometimes you have to improvise. Sometimes you have to tear it all down to make it right. I am Thomas Sullivan. I am 71 years old, and I am still building. If you enjoyed this story of tough love and justice, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And I want to ask you a question. Do you think I was too hard on Brian? Should I have forgiven him and let him keep the money, or was prison the only way he would ever learn? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you want to hear more stories about standing your ground and fighting back, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Until next time, keep your hands busy and your conscience clear. This story stands as ironclad proof that pampering a child with material wealth doesn't build character. It only breeds weak parasites. I learned the hard way that sometimes the greatest act of love a father can perform isn't to lift his son up, but to let him hit the cold, hard mud of reality. Money can buy skyscrapers, but it cannot buy a spine or integrity. The most valuable legacy we leave behind isn't a $1 million check, but the lesson of the value of sweat and honest, calloused hands. To save my son, I had to become the villain. What do you think about the sentence I handed down to Brian? Was sending him to prison and stripping his inheritance too cruel, or was it the necessary salvation he needed? Leave your thoughts below. I read every single comment. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join me for more dramatic stories of justice served.